For various reasons, I've been playing around with Blender's normal maps and displacement maps, and I thought it would be a good idea to do a quick demo of displacement maps in Blender. I have talked about these before when it comes to baking them out to normals, but I didn't really go into too much detail when it came to setting up the displacement. As you can see here, I've got actually a little bit of displacement on a few pieces here. And that's just all from the modifier. Now, when you actually add a displacement in from the modifier, it actually changes the topology of the geometry. Or should I say, it generates new topology for when you're actually going to render, or if you're going to export a piece of a model for 3D printing, you'll actually get the mesh, which is different from when you add displacement and texture. So to begin with, adding a displacement is very easy. All you have to do is select your geometry, go to your properties, choose the modifier, go to add modifier, and under deform, choose displace. Just that simple. You've already got it in place. If you disable and enable it, you can see that our geometry kind of changes sizes a little bit because it's just generally pushing out because it doesn't actually have any input information for the displacement, so it just generally displaces. And what we want to do is we want to actually add a texture or a procedural texture that will give us something a bit more specific. So in order to add a texture, all you have to do is click on New. Or if you already have a texture in existence, you can choose it from your pull down here just to select New. But I'm going to create a new one. And you can use local coordinates, but often local coordinates are basically just going to give you something very general and often very flat. It's usually a good idea to use UV. So it'll basically lay out your procedural texture or texture that you're applying based on the UVs of the object. So you have to make sure that you have the UVs of your geometry flattened out properly. And even if you have multiple UV maps, let's say you only want to use one specific one, you can also come into the pull down and just choose it. But I only have one, so it's just going to be using the default anyway. Direction. Normal is fine. You can play around with the others and see what sort of results you get, but I usually stick with normal. And by default, I'll usually stick with strength. I'll set it at around 0.2, which usually isn't too different from the default. And that's usually a good place I start with. Now, the next thing, since you've actually created the space for the texture, now we actually create the texture or tweak the texture. So we get onto texture in the properties, and by default, it's going to choose image or movie. We want to set it for one of the procedural texture options here. Now, for this demonstration, I'm going to use Musgrave, just because it gives you a lot of different options. And as you can see, we didn't really see a change on the surface yet. And why is that? Well, that's because displacement depends very much on the density of your mesh when it comes to this kind of displacement. If it were a texture map just feeding into a shader, or a normal map feeding into a shader, the density of the mesh really doesn't make a difference, other than sharp corners and edges catching lighting and things like that. But in this case, it's actually going to try to create geometry based on your existing topology. And if that topology is too low, it can't really do too much with it. So what we need to do is we need to increase the density of the mesh. And there's multiple ways you can do that. I'm going to use the simplest right now, which is just add a modifier, a general, and subdivide surface. I'm going to put that ahead of my displacement. I'm going to go back into my cube because I want to keep it as a cube. And I'm going to crease all of my edges just so it stays perfectly square. Now, one other thing you probably want to do, even with subdivide in place, is if your geometry is very, very, very simple, you may want to subdivide it a couple of times just to increase the density. Of course, this will make it heavier, so just keep that in mind. But in this case, we're not making this for a video game. We're actually just making this to bring out our displacement and to basically sculpt the surface. So I'm going to subdivide it normally in addition to the subdivision modifier. So I'm choosing my faces, and I'm going to subdivide, and I'll subdivide it, let's say, actually I'll just do 10. And then the rest I'll leave up to the subdivide surface. Now already you can start to see that I'm starting to get some deformation in the surface from my displacement. And if I increase my subdivisions to 4, you can see a bit more. I'm going to go back to the texture, and I can increase the density by decreasing its size, and now we can see that we get a lot of displacement on our surface. So it's actually sculpting the surface. If you look very close, you can actually see that it's deforming the surface. It's no longer a straight line, even though if you edit it, it's still got straight lines. But if you're out of edit mode, you can see the displacement. Now, you can play around with the quality of the displacement just by playing around with the density of the mesh. Now, I would suggest, if you are going to render this, that you also set both the levels for the viewport and the render to the same value, so that what you're seeing on screen is what's going to output. Otherwise, you'll get this lower subdivision, which would look like this when it renders. So you want to make sure you increase the values equally. And you can also go down to advanced, and you can change the limit surface to a higher value so that you have a little more breathing room, or else it may automatically try to restrict the subdivisions. So I'm going to put it on 5 and we'll see how that looks. And of course, you do have a lot of options. Even if you just choose this one type, you have additional options down here where you can choose more patterns to apply to the surface. One that I really like is Crackle, because it's great for creating like terrain or rocky surfaces. Okay, so when I choose this procedural, I generally will use the size to control the density of the texture and basically the size of the artifacts on the surface. And then I will set usually octaves and most of the other settings like dimension. I'll set all of these to 1. Usually you don't want to set these to 0 because usually they'll sort of wipe everything out. Actually, dimensions usually doesn't do too much to it, but these last two do. You want to leave these last two at usually around 1. And usually you're going to use the size and the intensity to mostly to adjust your texture if you're in this Crackle one. They're all a little different. You can just play around with them, see what's really going to enhance the surface to soften some of the cracks, maybe make it look more like rock. It really just depends. And you can leave the noise basis set at Crackle and switch to other types, and it'll give you other settings to play around with to try to change the appearance. Now, if you recall, when I showed the glove and the bodysuit on the previous character, there were parts of it that were not displaced. And it's actually very easy to do that without too much work. You don't have to create separate pieces or anything like that. You just have to select the area that you want or don't want to displace. It just depends. So select your geometry, go into edit mode, and I suggest switching to transparent mode, which is just Shift-Z on your keyboard. And then you can just select the vertices that, let's say, you do or you don't want to displace. And then you go down to data for your topology, and you add a vertex group. Even if you have weighting in here, you can add a vertex group specifically for this purpose. I usually just call it something like based on what the object is, and then disp for displace. And once you create that group, you have everything selected, make sure the weight value is set at 1, and then assign. And that's it. And now we go back to our modifier, and where it says vertex group, you just choose the vertex group that you created. Okay? And as you can see right away, it's only displacing that side. But what if you want it to displace the other side? We don't want to flip the object, so we can actually flip the selection. So it just inverts it, just like that. And you can easily go in to your selection area. If let's say you don't have enough selected, you can select a few more vertices, go back to your group, and just assign those verts to it, and then we've added a bit more to it, and so it's pushed back a little further. Okay, it's that simple. And usually this is very useful if you have a model that has interior faces. You don't need those interior faces to displace, just the ones on the exterior. So you can just basically take all that inner topology and tell it not to displace. And it'll decrease the number of faces, and it also make it a hell of a lot easier on your computer to render. Now, in addition to the basic settings under the texture, you can also adjust the brightness and the contrast to refine or adjust the depth. Let me put all contrast all the way up to 1. And so now you can see that it's a bit sharper. There's more depth. The cracks go a little deeper into the surface. And of course, if you want to decrease it, you can go the exact opposite direction. So once I put it at 0.2, and now it's just sort of a subtle hint. It looks more like a tile on a kitchen floor. So you can just play around with it until you get what you want. And don't forget, you're actually carving into the surface when you do this. Now, as an example, here's a model that I created back when I was a student. It was a rock ape called Igu, based on an old cartoon called the Herculoids. And so originally I painted a displacement map to give myself some cracks and to try to make it look like stone. It never quite looked exactly what I wanted it to look like, but it came out pretty good. But here it is with the displacement applied. Igu, the rock ape.